Welcome to this third class of the course. My name is Brian Russell Graham. You are reading chapter 8 of the book for today. I hope you enjoyed making your way through the author's discussion of social justice, scholarship, and thought. Let's dive straight into it. I had asked you to work with the questions you can see here, and I'd like to proceed by going through them one by one. My impression is that the first section and the latter parts of this chapter are more critical in their approach than the other parts of the same chapter, where the emphasis is more on explanation. Perhaps I might just rehearse what a reader of this chapter might enjoy in terms of forthright critique, thereby responding to that first question. Perhaps you were impressed by how, in the opening section, the authors persuasively account for the process whereby the social justice viewpoint became a meta-narrative in its own right. Social justice scholars, the authors remark, behave as if they had discovered, quote, the analogue of the germ theory of disease, but for bigotry and oppression. Also piquant is the iteration of social justice dogma outlined in the first section, presented as the beliefs stemming from the development of the postmodern political principle. The texts of this movement, quote, express with absolute certainty that all white people are racist, all men are sexist, racism and sexism are systems that can exist and oppress, absent even a single person with racist or sexist intentions or beliefs. Sex is biological and exists on a spectrum. Language can be literal violence. Denial of gender identity is killing people. The wish to remedy disability and obesity is hateful, and everything needs to be decolonized. Turning to thou shalt not disagree with theory, perhaps like me you were impressed by their critical foregrounding of Applebaum's sophistry, specifically her shameless reconfiguring of asking for clarifications as genuine disagreement, her reimagining of actual disagreement as a lack of engagement, and her recasting of the feeling that you are being censored when you are as the mere result of a prior refusal to engage. No doubt you were impressed by their critical account of how Bailey reconceptualizes actual dissent as epistemic pushback, and how they flesh out the cynical nature of reading all acts of nonconformity as privilege preserving, a point reinforced by the humor of the repeat comparison between activists with the Borg from Star Trek. Resistance is futile. And who could not enjoy the author's critique of Robin DiAngelo's work? The discussion shines a bright light on how there is as much room for dissent in DiAngelo's writings as there is in Bailey's. Here it is not simply a matter of the non-compliant refusing to engage or preserving their privilege. All nonconformity is brazenly reinscribed as evidence of white fragility, whether it's disagreeing, remaining silent, or heading for the door. And no doubt you got a lot out of the coda of this chapter, the summary at the end where they speak of the social justice ideology as a new religion. If we turn to question 2, no doubt I should concede that it's not entirely accurate to say that the rest of the discussion in this chapter is entirely bereft of a critical perspective. After all, the authors flesh out the absurdity of Medina's account of social justice etiquette, which is of course entirely contradictory. Having introduced Medina's hermeneutical death and hermeneutical privacy, the authors remark, quote, so marginalized people can be oppressed to the point of psychic death by not being understood, but the right to be completely incomprehensible should also be respected. And at one point, turning the tables on theorists, They suggest that it is racist and sexist to somehow tie a preference for reason and evidence to the identity compound of white Western men. So, criticisms, of course, are present. But it seems to me that in spite of these critical flashes, in these sections, the authors are carrying out the task they give themselves at the outset in their introduction. Much of the chapter is more of a guide. So, which aspects of the guide did we enjoy? Something you might have enjoyed in Postmodernism Evolving is the introduction to research justice, whereby the scholar should practice a kind of affirmative action with respect to sources in their work, citing the scholar from an underrepresented group rather than a privileged scholar when you have the choice. You may also have taken a guilty pleasure in the author's characterization of how theory came to be obsessed with knowing and knowers, epistemology, and the plethora of neologisms, read buzzwords, introduced to describe, in rather hyperbolic terms, aspects of how society belittles some knowers and knowledges. That's what we read about in the section bearing the title A Menagerie of New Terms. The next section is Who You Are is What You Know. And no doubt you learned a lot from the commentary on the evolution of knowledges, quote, whereby reason and evidence are at best only one sets of means whereby one kind of knowledge can be generated, and a lot from their explanation of how lived experience, vaunted by theorists, really only adds up to experiential knowledge. And when reading A Different Kind of Color Blindness, I'm sure you were appreciative of the introduction to standpoint epistemology and the additions to the menagerie of terms, which draws on the work of Medina once more. So a great deal to enjoy and wonder at. Of course, on top of all this, we shouldn't forget the main argument of this chapter. It is the author's contention that postmodernism, its two principles and its four themes, go through such a transformation in the second decade of the present century that the pendulum swings from relativism back to something approaching absolutism. We might say cognitive relativism back to something approaching cognitive absolutism. In the words of the authors, it's as though activist scholars draw on, all capitals, the truth according to social justice. And the authors present their case persuasively and with great gusto. My third question was, what else would you have liked to have heard more about? Something I would have liked to have heard more about is the opposite view from the one focused upon when the authors speak of standpoint epistemology. What the authors alert us to is one half of a dialectic, I would suggest. But there is more to the study of knowledge, and it would also have been good with a full account of the dialectic in play. There is a passage in Anthony Kronman's wonderful book, Education's End, which sheds light on the dialectic I have in mind. First, Kronman does justice to the fact that the underlying values of standpoint epistemology can be traced all the way back to the Old Testament prophets and the authority they had. And I'll just read from this quotation. The idea that victims of injustice see the world more deeply and clearly than their oppressors is not a new one. It is a central theme in the prophetic books of the Hebrew Bible and in the Christian Gospels. The prophet who sides with the poor and oppressed, the forgotten and abused, with those who lack power and stand outside the circle of worldly authority and respect, sees things from a vantage point that those within the circle cannot reach. For they, the possessors of authority and power, have an interest in the system of oppression. They cannot see it because they are a part of it. But the prophet and his followers are not, and because they are not, their eyes are open to the things the rich and powerful and contented of the world can never comprehend, things their own privilege prevents them from grasping. Having offered this thumbnail sketch of the pedigree of this way of thinking about knowledge and knowers, Kronman then provides us with an idea of the opposing way of thinking about the same categories. And I quote again, "But there is a competing and equally venerable idea that must also be given its due in any open-minded encounter with the tradition of the West. This is the idea that privilege and good fortune enable sound judgment rather than compromise it. It is the person of well-being whose judgments should be our standard, the person of comfortable circumstances who has the leisure to grow into a rounded, healthy human being." There we have it, the other half of the dialectic. Of course, the ideal is not to invest in the opposite view, the one vaunting the merits of the educated. Rather, we need to aim to keep these countries in suspension and resist the temptation to invest in one half of this opposition. Articulating what is essentially a liberal view, Kronman concludes, "To understand the civilization of the West, to become its inhabitant in some personally meaningful sense, one must make this conflict one's own. One must confront it, grapple with it, and make of its competing visions of humanity what one can." I think it would also have been good with more about ignorance studies and an evaluation of it. The book does include a number of references to the fact that ignorance has become an important buzzword in social justice scholarship, but there is not enough about this. Once the scholar adopts this viewpoint, social justice ideology, let's call it, they start to think of a range of identities, some of which are privileged, as being characterized by ignorance. Before they know it, great vistas of ignorance open before social justice scholars: white ignorance, male ignorance, etc., etc. The number of new titles, including the term ignorance, suggests that the notion of identity-based ignorance studies might go on growing and become an even bigger part of social justice scholarship. And for that reason, a bit more about it here would have been useful. If you're curious about this side of the latest phase of postmodernism, the study you can see on this slide might be a good place to start. You could also pause the video if you've not had time to read the blurb. My fourth question invited you to air any criticisms of the chapter that you might have. Perhaps again I might rehearse a possible response to this question. As I have already explained in earlier lectures, I think there is a problem with the argument arc in this book. The story that is told is one in which a number of ideas incubate in universities over the course of decades and only impact on the world outside of universities from 2010 onwards. As I've suggested, we need a narrative which does justice to how lots of developments outside the university are also key to this story. So ideally, the story would back and forth between the world and the university. In my last lecture, I commented on how it would have made sense to have started not with the high deconstructive phase of the late 60s and 70s, but with the burgeoning of identity politics in the mid-60s. At the juncture we have reached, we become aware of how the book fails to provide an account of something concomitant with the high deconstructive phase, namely the beginning of the process whereby the middle class left, of which the academic left is a part, started to drift away from the working class. There are a number of references in the book to the academic left's ambivalence towards the working class. And in this particular chapter, chapter 8, we read about how, and I quote, "one startling omission in the list of intersectional identities is any meaningful mention of economic class. But there's not nearly enough about why this is in the book. I think that this is a serious omission from a book on this theme. After all, it's a salient feature of social justice scholarship, this coldness towards the working class. Additionally, some of us instinctively grasp the fact that turning away from the working class represented a mistake on the part of the academic left. But it's only when we look into why this happened that we can appreciate the exact nature of the mistake and why our instincts were right all along. You might think of this as a contemporary issue or a characteristic of the 90s, but the story of how the middle class left, and therefore the academic left, started to lose interest in the working class goes back further than that. The account of this development in Barbara Ehrenreich's Fear of Falling is the best I have come across. She suggests that the story starts with the middle class discovery of the working class in the wake of the riots at the Democratic Convention in Chicago in 1968. What the middle class discovered, argues Ehrenreich, was essentially a projection. The working class were dumb, reactionary, and bigoted. But of course, that was simply a reflection of the mood of the middle classes themselves. Nonetheless, myths started to get peddled. Not only were the blue-collar workers pessimistic compared to middle-class workers, they were less sympathetic to redistributive measures aimed at African Americans. They were uncouth. They swore when they appeared on television. They were unsympathetic towards the professional middle classes. And blue-collar workers, to a man, were ready to be violent when confronted by students protesting the war in Vietnam. That was the myth, anyway. The portrayal of the working class on TV and film dovetailed perfectly with this media representation. TV served up All in the Family, while Hollywood dished up films such as Joe from 1970 and Taxi Driver from 1976. Roughly speaking, states Ehrenreich, the result was two overlapping images. On television, the blue-collar male as buffoon, and in the movies, the blue-collar buffoon as mass murderer. If academics were too busy to tune in or go to the movies, their own reputedly hallowed halls were churning out complementary stereotypes, explains Ehrenreich. Her focus is sociology, and she gives the example of sociologist Seymour Martin Lispet, whose influential essay, Working Class Authoritarianism, played a part in the manufacturing of what she calls the myth of working class intolerance and authoritarianism. And of course, most damning of all for the middle class left was the idea that the working class had drifted to the political right. Across the country, the working class had voted for the segregationist George Wallace in far greater numbers than the middle classes had. So they believed. They had done so because they had deserted the left. They were ex-leftists. These were not the kind of people who had supported Robert F. Kennedy before his assassination, it was assumed. And the resentments Wallace appealed to were race-based only. You would need to add a lot of nuance to this picture to render it more accurate, and that's what Ehrenreich does in her book. But that's not our concern here. Her concern here is her main concern, that across media, film, TV, and even research, the public image of the blue-collar worker was refashioned in a grossly unfair manner in the 1970s. Against this backdrop, the middle-class left should have stuck to their historic allyship with the working class, demanding of the Democrats that they redouble their efforts to win back those who voted for Wallace. But it didn't. And so began a protracted falling out of the middle-class left and the working class, first in the United States, but subsequently in other countries. Left-wing academics were no different from other members of the middle class left, and the present-day indifference to the working class can be traced back through the decades of animosity to these origins. That story is an integral part of the story the authors tell in Cynical Theories, and ideally, the book would also have covered it. Next chapter in Cynical Theories, the final one, is also the final one we're going to speak about is also a key chapter. If theory is no good as a basis for our constitution of knowledge, then what would a good basis be? The author's intention all along is to defend liberalism generally and epistemic liberalism more specifically in connection with knowledge production. As you read the chapter, I suggest you give some thought to these questions. Number one, which aspects of the defense and celebration of the liberalism in this chapter do you find most striking? Some readers might feel that the authors are insufficiently tough on the two principles and four themes of postmodernism in this chapter, while others might find them too critical. What is your view? Is anything missing from this discussion of the merits of liberalism? See you next time when we'll conclude our reading of Cynical Theories.